There is an animal that has lived in the human imagination for over a century and a half, and in that time, it has been many things. It has been a monster, a machine, a cold-blooded killing engine moving on instinct alone through a world dominated by sheer force. It has appeared on movie screens and in children's books and in the nightmares of people who encountered it first as a skeleton in a museum and could not quite believe that something so large had ever been real. It was real, and more strange, and more alive than anything the imagination has built from its bones. The animal we are talking about is Tyrannosaurus rex, and what science has learned about it over the past 3 decades, about how it moved, how it thought, how it raised its young, how it hunted, how it communicated, what it felt, what it experienced in the course of a single day in the late Cretaceous, has dismantled almost everything the popular image suggested and replaced it with something far more complex, far more interesting, and in many ways far more unsettling than the simple monster of the movies. This is the story of what T-Rex actually was, not the icon, not the exhibit, not the creature that roars across a cinema screen. The animal, the living, breathing, warm-blooded, yes, almost certainly warm-blooded, biological entity that walked the floodplains of what is now Western North America approximately 66 to 68 million years ago. At the very end of the Cretaceous period, in the final chapter of the age of non-avian dinosaurs, to understand T-Rex, we need to start not with the animal itself, but with where it lived. Because an animal cannot be understood outside its environment, and the environment of the late Cretaceous was as different from our world as any place on Earth has ever been. The world of Tyrannosaurus rex was a world in transition. The continents were not where they are today. North America was divided by a shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway, a body of water that ran from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, splitting the continent roughly down the middle. To the west of this seaway lay a landmass called Laramidia, a long, narrow strip of land running from roughly present-day Alaska to present-day Mexico. And it was on Laramidia that T-Rex lived. Laramidia was not the dry, open plain that science fiction has often depicted. It was a landscape of extraordinary richness and complexity. Dense forests of flowering plants, the angiosperms that had radiated spectacularly during the Cretaceous, lined river systems and covered the uplands. Ferns and cycads carpeted the forest floors. The climate was warmer than today's, without permanent polar ice caps, and the interior of Laramidia was humid and lush, a subtropical world of rivers and swamps and forested lowlands bounded to the west by the rising Rocky Mountains. The air was rich in oxygen. The seasons existed, but were less extreme than today's. The nights were dark in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate now. No light pollution, no artificial illumination of any kind. Just the darkness of a world that had never known fire except in the form of lightning-struck forests. And through this world, T-Rex moved. It was not the only large predator in its ecosystem, though it was by far the largest. The fauna of late Cretaceous Laramidia included an extraordinary diversity of animals. Triceratops, the three-horned ceratopsian, was one of T-Rex's most common prey animals, a creature that could weigh 8 tons or more, and that bore a frill and 3 horns capable of inflicting serious injury on any predator. Edmontosaurus, a large hadrosaur or duck-billed dinosaur, moved in herds through the lowland forests, a social, vocal, potentially migrating animal whose bones are among the most abundant in the fossil record of the period. Ankylosaurus, armored like a living tank, moved slowly through the undergrowth, its tail club a weapon capable of shattering bone. Pachycephalosaurus, with its thick domed skull, butted heads with rivals in forest clearings. Pterosaurs still ruled the skies above, some of them enormous. Quetzalcoatlus, one of the largest flying animals that ever lived, soared over the floodplains on wings that spanned 10 meters or more. This was the world T-Rex inhabited. Not a desolate wasteland, but a rich, complex, biologically diverse ecosystem. The most productive ecosystem of the Mesozoic era, teeming with life at every level of the food chain. And T-Rex was at the top of it. To understand what T-Rex actually was, you need to understand how much of what we believe about it has changed in the last 30 years. As recently as the 1980s, the standard scientific image of Tyrannosaurus rex was of a large, slow-moving, primarily scavenging reptile. A cold-blooded animal whose metabolism was similar to a large crocodile's, that dragged its tail on the ground, that moved with the sluggish efficiency of a monitor lizard scaled up to 10 tons, that relied more on finding carcasses than on actively hunting live prey. This image was not invented from nothing. It was built from genuine scientific reasoning, from analogy with living reptiles, from estimates of locomotion based on bone geometry, from interpretations of tooth morphology and bite force. The scientists who held it were not being lazy or unimaginative. They were working with the evidence available to them and applying the tools of their discipline as best they could. But the evidence has changed dramatically, beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 90s and 2000s. A series of discoveries and analytical advances transformed paleontology's understanding of dinosaurs in general and T-Rex in particular. New fossil sites produced new specimens in unprecedented quality. Techniques borrowed from chemistry and physics, isotopic analysis, kinetic scanning, histological examination of bone microstructure allowed scientists to extract information from fossils that no one had imagined was available. The discovery of feathered dinosaurs in China in the 1990s reframed the entire question of what dinosaurs were and where they sat in the tree of life. What emerged from all of this was a picture of T-Rex that would have been unrecognizable to the scientists of the 1970s. T-Rex was not cold-blooded. The microstructure of its bones, the internal architecture that records how fast bone tissue was deposited during growth, shows a pattern consistent with rapid, sustained growth of the kind seen in warm-blooded animals. Studies of bone chemistry, including oxygen isotope ratios and the distribution of stable isotopes in different parts of the skeleton, indicate that T-Rex maintained elevated body temperatures, not the fluctuating temperatures of a reptile dependent on external heat sources. T-Rex, the evidence now strongly suggests, was endothermic. It generated its own body heat metabolocally. As birds and mammals do, T-Rex did not drag its tail. This was established clearly enough by the discovery of trackways, fossilized footprints, showing that large theropods moved with their bodies horizontal and their tails raised clear of the ground, used as a counterbalance to the forward weight of the head. The old image of a tail-dragging T-Rex has been thoroughly retired from the scientific literature, though it persists stubbornly in older museum exhibits and the imaginations of people who encountered the animal before the revision. T-Rex almost certainly had feathers, at minimum as a juvenile and possibly throughout its life, or at least during certain life stages. The evidence comes from multiple directions. The feathers found on its close relatives in China, particularly within the Tyrannosaurid family. The discovery of skin impressions from T. rex specimens that suggest scales in some areas of the body, which is consistent with a mosaic covering of both scales and feathers, similar to that seen in some modern birds, and the evolutionary logic that places T. rex firmly within a lineage whose common ancestry with modern feathered birds is no longer in any serious scientific doubt. And T. rex was by any reasonable measure intelligent. Not intelligent in the human sense, not self-aware, not capable of abstract thought, but intelligent in the way that a large, socially complex, long-lived predator needs to be intelligent to succeed in a competitive ecosystem. Its brain, as revealed by CT scans of skull endocasts, was large relative to its body size, with particularly well-developed olfactory bulbs, the brain regions associated with smell, and optic lobes consistent with excellent forward-facing binocular vision. It could see, it could smell, it could process information about its environment in ways that went beyond the simple stimulus response of the old cold-blooded reptile model. This is the animal we are going to spend time with tonight. Not the icon, but the organism. Not the monster, but the living creature that was, for its place and its time, one of the most extraordinary animals that has ever existed on this planet. Before we go further into the life of T. rex, it is worth spending some time with the bones themselves. Because the fossil record of Tyrannosaurus rex is, by the standards of large Mesozoic dinosaurs, remarkably good. We have a lot of T. rex. At the time of writing, paleontologists have identified remains from approximately 50 individual Tyrannosaurus rex specimens, ranging from nearly complete skeletons to fragmentary remains, isolated teeth, single bones, pieces of skull. This might not sound like a large number, and by the standards of the fossil record for most organisms, it is not. But for a large-bodied apex predator from 66 million years ago, it is exceptional. Apex predators are always rare in ecosystems. They sit at the top of the food chain, and the amount of energy available at each successive level of a food chain diminishes as you go up. The efficiency of energy transfer from prey to predator is low enough that the population of any given predator is necessarily much smaller than the population of the animals it eats. A single T. rex required a territory large enough to supply it with sufficient prey. The total population of T. rex at any given time across the whole of Laramidia has been estimated at various figures, but a commonly cited analysis suggests it may have been around 20,000 individuals at any one time, comparable to the population of a small town spread across a continent. 20,000 animals spread across a continent over a species lifespan of perhaps 2 to 3 million years. The probability that any individual animal would die in circumstances that allowed fossilization, buried in sediment, not scavenged, not subjected to geological processes that would destroy the material, was vanishingly small. The probability that such a fossil would then be preserved intact for 66 million years, survive the movements of tectonic plates and the erosion and deposition of rock, and eventually be exposed at the surface in a place and at a time when a human being, with the knowledge to recognize it, would walk by. This probability borders on the miraculous. And yet here we are, 50 specimens, enough to reconstruct the basic biology of the animal, enough to study variation between individuals, enough to see something of how it grew and how it aged, and in a few extraordinary cases, something of how it died. The most complete T. Rex skeleton ever found is known informally as Sue, named for Sue Hendrickson, the fossil hunter who discovered it in South Dakota in 1990. Sue's skeleton is approximately 90% complete, an extraordinary degree of preservation for any large vertebrate fossil. Sue is now exhibited at the Field Museum in Chicago, and the skeleton that visitors see, 12.5 meters long, 4 meters tall at the hip, is as close as any living human being will ever come to being in the physical presence of a complete Tyrannosaurus Rex. But Sue is not simply a display. The specimen has been the subject of intensive scientific study, and what that study has revealed about T. Rex's life history, health, and biology could fill several volumes. Sue shows evidence of multiple pathologies, diseases, and injuries recorded in the bones. There are signs of gout, a condition caused by the accumulation of uric acid crystals in joint tissues, and one that in modern animals is associated with a high-protein diet. Exactly what you would expect from an apex predator consuming large quantities of meat. There are healed injuries, broken ribs, damaged vertebrae that record encounters with prey animals or rivals that Sue survived. And there is evidence in the infection patterns on Sue's jawbones of a parasitic infection similar to trichomoniasis, a disease caused by a protozoan parasite that today afflicts birds of prey. Sue was sick in the last years of her life. She was injured. She bore the physical record of a life lived at the top of a dangerous food chain, in competition with the largest prey animals and potentially with rivals of her own species. And she survived all of it long enough to reach a size and age that suggests decades of successful living. She is not a skeleton. She is a biography, written in bone. The question of how T. Rex moved has consumed an enormous amount of scientific effort, and the answers that have emerged are more nuanced and more interesting than the simple estimates that dominated earlier decades. The early reconstructions of T-Rex locomotion based primarily on analogy with large living reptiles and on simple biomechanical calculations suggested that T-Rex was relatively slow, capable of sustained speeds perhaps comparable to a fast human walk, with brief bursts of faster movement possible, but metabolically costly. These estimates were partly driven by the old cold-blooded model. A slow metabolism implied, slow locomotion limited by the same constraints that limit crocodiles and monitor lizards. As the warm-blooded model gained ground, the locomotion estimate shifted. A warm-blooded T. Rex with the elevated metabolic capacity that endothermy implies could, in principle, sustain much higher speeds than a cold-blooded one. Some researchers in the 1990s argued for top speeds of 60 or even 70 kilometers per hour, running speeds that would have made T-Rex competitive with many of its prey animals and that featured prominently in popular reconstructions of the period, including in film. But the biomechanics told a more complicated story. Computer modeling studies examining the relationship between bone strength, muscle mass, body weight, and locomotor mechanics converged on a more sobering conclusion. A T-Rex moving at 60 kilometers per hour would have placed such enormous stress on its leg bones that the probability of catastrophic fracture during a single running stride would have been unacceptably high. The bones were not built for that speed. The legs were strong, enormously strong, but they were designed for power and endurance, not for the elastic, spring-like mechanics of high-speed running. The current scientific consensus, as best as it can be summarized, suggests that T-Rex was a relatively fast walker capable of sustained walking speeds of perhaps 5 to 8 kilometers per hour, which is fast by the standards of large animals, and that true running, in the biomechanical sense of having both feet off the ground simultaneously, was either impossible or possible only at relatively modest speeds. A top speed of around 20 kilometers per hour is often cited as a reasonable estimate with significant uncertainty in both directions. 20 kilometers per hour, roughly the speed of a moderately fast human jogger. This might seem disappointing given the grandeur of the animal, but consider the context. It was hunting Triceratops and Edmontosaurus, animals that, for all their size, were not themselves built for high speed. In an ecosystem of large, relatively slow-moving herbivores, an apex predator capable of sustained fast walking and moderate running had all the locomotor capacity it needed. And there is another dimension to T-Rex locomotion that the speed debates have sometimes overshadowed: the energetic efficiency of its gait. Studies of the proportions of T-Rex's hind limbs, the relatively long lower leg segments, the positioning of the foot bones, suggest that, as a walker, T-Rex was highly efficient. Its gait may have been mechanically optimized for covering large distances with minimal metabolic cost, in the way that the long legs of a horse or an ostrich allow sustained locomotion at relatively low energetic expense. T-Rex may have been a tireless traveler, capable of ranging over large territories without the rapid energy depletion that would have limited a less efficiently designed animal. This makes sense for an apex predator that needed to patrol a large territory, monitor the movements of prey herds, and occasionally cover great distances to find food. Not a sprinter, a traveler. An animal built for the long game. The arms of Tyrannosaurus rex are among the most discussed and most misunderstood features of the animal's anatomy. They are small, disproportionately, almost comically small, relative to the massive body and enormous head. They could not reach the mouth. They were, by any casual assessment, pathetically underpowered for an animal of this size. The popular image of T-Rex as somehow hampered or even embarrassed by its tiny arms has become a cultural touchstone, the subject of jokes, of memes, of endless commentary on what appears to be a design flaw in an otherwise formidable predator. But the arms of T-Rex were not vestigial. They were not on their way to disappearing. They were within their functional range, extremely powerful. Each arm, though short, was equipped with 2 clawed fingers and a musculature that, scaled to the arm's size, was massive. Studies of the arm bones and the attachment points of the muscles they supported suggest that T-Rex could flex each arm with a force of approximately 200 kilograms, far greater than the arm strength of any living animal of comparable limb size. The arms were not designed for reaching or grasping at distance. They were designed for holding, for gripping something at close range with tremendous force and not letting go. What were they holding? The honest scientific answer is that we are not entirely certain. Several hypotheses have been proposed. The arms may have been used to grip prey during feeding, holding a struggling carcass stable while the jaws tore into it. They may have played a role in mating behavior, helping the animal maintain contact with a partner during copulation in a way that the massive and unwieldy body would otherwise have made difficult. They may have assisted the animal in rising from a prone position, pushing against the ground to help lift the enormous head and body from rest, in the way that some large mammals use their forelimbs to assist in standing. None of these hypotheses is definitively proven. What is clear is that the arms were retained, not reduced to nothing, as they could have been over millions of years of evolution. If they were truly useless, and that they were powerfully muscled. Evolution does not invest in structures that provide no return. The arms of T. Rex were small for a reason and powerful for a reason, and understanding those reasons is one of the open questions in T-Rex biology that continues to generate research. The world that Tyrannosaurus rex experienced was fundamentally different from the world experienced by the prey animals it hunted, the rivals it competed with, and the young it may have raised. This is because T-Rex had senses that were, by the standards of its ecosystem, extraordinary. Senses tuned to the specific demands of being the largest apex predator in the most productive terrestrial ecosystem of the Mesozoic era. Understanding the senses of T-Rex means understanding the physical world it inhabited through the body it had. And when we do this carefully, when we follow the evidence rather than the assumption, we find an animal whose experience of its environment was richer, more precise, and in some ways more sophisticated than anything the old cold-blooded reptile model would have led anyone to expect. Start with vision. The eyes of T-Rex were large, each eye roughly 13 centimeters in diameter, comparable to a large orange set in a skull that was specifically shaped to provide a significant degree of forward-facing binocular overlap. This matters enormously. In most animals, the eyes are positioned on the sides of the head, providing a wide field of view to detect predators or rivals approaching from any direction. In predators that rely on precise distance judgment, on knowing exactly how far away a target is in order to strike accurately, the eyes have migrated toward the front of the face, creating an overlapping field of vision where both eyes see the same object from slightly different angles. The brain processes this slight difference in perspective to generate a three-dimensional image with excellent depth perception. This is the logic of binocular vision, and it is the reason that owls and eagles and cats and human beings all have forward-facing eyes. It is also the reason that T-Rex had forward-facing eyes. Paleontologist Kent Stevens, using computer modeling to reconstruct the visual fields of various dinosaurs from their skull anatomy, found that T-Rex had a binocular field of roughly 55 degrees, greater than that of a hawk, and comparable to some of the best-sighted predatory birds alive today. This is not the visual field of an animal that was primarily a scavenger, stumbling upon carcasses by chance. This is the visual field of an animal that tracked moving prey, judged distances precisely, and struck with accuracy. The acuity of T-Rex's vision, the fineness of detail it could resolve, is harder to estimate directly from fossils, but the size of the eye and the probable density of photoreceptors in the retina suggest it was excellent. Some researchers have proposed, based on comparisons with living archosaurs of similar eye dimensions, that T-Rex may have been able to resolve detail at distances several times greater than a human being can. If this is correct, T-Rex could potentially detect movement or distinguish the shape of a prey animal at distances of several kilometers, a capability that would have been invaluable for an animal hunting large herbivores in open floodplain environments, and T-Rex almost certainly saw in color. This is not a speculation. It follows from the evolutionary position of the animal. Dinosaurs are archosaurs, the group that also includes modern birds and crocodilians. Birds, the living dinosaurs, have 4 types of color receptors in their eyes, compared to the 3 that humans have, giving them a color vision that extends into the ultraviolet range, richer and more nuanced than our own. Crocodilians have 2. The ancestral archosaur condition appears to have included robust color vision. There is no reason to think that T-Rex Rex, embedded in this lineage, would have had impoverished color vision and considerable reason to think it saw the world in colors and contrasts that would have been vivid and informationally rich. This matters for understanding T. rex's behavior. An animal with rich color vision does not simply detect the presence of prey at a distance. It reads the environment in terms of color patterns that convey information about health, age, emotional state, species, identity. It notices the color of a competitor's display. It reads the flush of pigmentation in a potential mate. It distinguishes ripe carcass from fresh kill. Color vision is not just about seeing things. It is about reading the visual language of the world. T. rex was, in all likelihood, reading that language continuously. If vision was one primary sense for T. rex, smell was at least its equal and quite possibly its superior. The olfactory bulbs of T. rex, the brain regions dedicated to processing odor information, were, relative to overall brain size, enormous. This is known from the study of endocasts, casts of the interior of the skull cavity that preserve an approximate record of the brain's external shape. When paleontologists examine endocasts of T. rex skulls, the olfactory bulbs are striking in their proportional size, not as large as those of an albatross, which navigates across ocean basins using smell, but large enough to suggest that olfaction was a primary information channel for T. rex, one of the main ways it gathered information about its environment. A large olfactory system is consistent with several aspects of T. rex's ecology as an apex predator in a forested and riverine environment. T. rex would have frequently needed to detect prey that was out of visual range, hidden by vegetation, obscured by topography, or simply too far away for even excellent vision to detect. Smell carries information across these distances and around these obstacles. A scent trail left by a herd of hadrosaurs moving through a forest is detectable long after the animals have passed and long before they are visible. The smell of blood from a wounded animal can carry for kilometers on the right wind. T. rex's olfactory capability was also almost certainly important for detecting carcasses. This does not mean T. rex was primarily a scavenger. The evidence, as we will discuss, strongly suggests it was primarily an active hunter, but it would be strange for any large predator to ignore a significant food source when one presented itself. A dead triceratops, even one killed by a rival T. rex, represented an enormous caloric resource that a hungry animal would be motivated to locate and, if possible, claim. The ability to smell a carcass from kilometers away would have been adaptive regardless of whether the animal had killed it or not. There is also a social dimension to olfaction that is worth considering. In living archosaurs, particularly birds, chemical signals play roles in species recognition, mate assessment, and territorial communication that are not always obvious to human observers, since our own olfactory systems are relatively poorly developed. If T. rex communicated chemically through secretions from skin glands, through urine or feces deposited in specific locations, through the odors produced by specific physiological states, its large olfactory system would have been essential for both producing and interpreting these signals. We cannot know for certain whether T. rex engaged in olfactory communication of this kind, but the anatomical investment in olfactory processing suggests that smell was not merely a hunting tool, but a full channel of social and environmental information. The hearing of T. rex is another area where the evidence paints a picture very different from the roaring, thunderous creature of popular imagination. The cochlea, The hearing organ of the inner ear can be reconstructed from CT scans of fossil skulls, and its dimensions provide information about the frequencies an animal was most sensitive to. Studies of T-Rex cochlear geometry suggest that T-Rex was most sensitive to sounds in the low frequency range, roughly the same frequency range as a modern crocodile or a large bird like an emu. This means deep, resonant sounds rather than high-pitched ones. This low-frequency sensitivity has a direct implication for how T-Rex communicated. Animals that are most sensitive to low-frequency sounds tend to produce low-frequency sounds, both because this is the range in which they can hear most acutely and because low-frequency sounds travel farther through environments like dense forest than high-frequency ones do. The roar of T-Rex, the iconic, terrifying sound that cinema has given it, may be completely wrong. What T-Rex actually produced may have been a deep resonant boom or rumble felt as much as heard, similar to the infronic calls of modern elephants or the deep booming of cassowaries and emus, a sound that traveled for kilometers through the forests of the late Cretaceous, carrying information about identity, location, and social status to others of its species across distances too great for vision to bridge. This is speculation built on solid physiological inference, but it is speculation nonetheless. We cannot hear a T-Rex. We will never hear a T-Rex, but the anatomy of its inner ear tells us something about the register in which it experienced sound, and the picture that emerges is of an animal whose acoustic world was deep and low and resonant, a world very different from the thundering roar of cinema. Now we come to the question that, perhaps more than any other, has transformed the scientific understanding of T-Rex in recent decades. How intelligent was it? Intelligence is a difficult concept to apply to an extinct animal. We cannot give T-Rex an IQ test. We cannot observe its problem-solving behavior directly. What we can do is examine the brain, its size, its structure, the relative development of different regions, and compare this to living animals whose intelligence we can actually study. The brain of T-Rex was, in absolute terms, not large. A T-Rex weighing approximately 9 tons had a brain roughly the size of a large orange. Compare this to a modern sperm whale, which has the largest brain of any animal on Earth, or to an elephant, or even to a relatively small primate. By any of these comparisons, T-Rex's brain seems modest, but brain size in absolute terms is not the right metric for comparing intelligence across animals of very different body sizes. The relevant measure is the ratio of brain size to body size. How much neural tissue an animal has relative to what its body size alone would predict. When this ratio, called the encephalization quotient or EQ, is calculated for T-Rex, the result places it comfortably above most living reptiles and in the range of many modern birds, which are, after all, its closest living relatives. Within the brain itself, the distribution of neural tissue tells us about function. The large olfactory bulbs we have already noted. The optic lobes, the brain regions that process visual information, were also well developed, consistent with the good vision indicated by the eye anatomy. The cerebellum, which coordinates movement and balance, was substantial, appropriate for an animal that needed to precisely coordinate the movement of a very large and somewhat awkwardly proportioned body. And the cerebrum, the region most associated with higher cognitive functions like learning, memory, and behavioral flexibility, was not negligible. In 2023, a study by neuroscientist Susanna Herculanehoozle attracted significant attention by estimating the number of neurons in T. Rex's brain, using a method based on brain volume and the known relationship between brain size and neuron count in different animal groups. The estimates produced by this analysis were striking. T. Rex may have had a neuron count comparable to a large primate, a baboon, say, or a macaque, rather than the much lower counts typical of modern reptiles. These estimates generated considerable scientific debate. Critics argued that applying neuron density estimates from living birds to T. Rex was methodologically problematic given the significant differences in brain structure and the uncertainty inherent in working from endocasts rather than actual brain tissue. The debate is ongoing, and the specific neuron count estimates should be treated with appropriate caution. But the debate itself is significant because it reflects how dramatically the question has shifted. A generation ago, no one was seriously debating whether T. Rex might have had primate-level cognitive complexity. The question was not even on the table. Now it is, because the evidence, imperfect, incomplete, subject to ongoing interpretation, is consistent enough with a more cognitively sophisticated T. Rex. That responsible science cannot dismiss the possibility. What would cognitive sophistication have meant for T. Rex? In practice, it would have meant the ability to learn from experience, to remember the locations of successful hunting grounds, the movements of prey herds through the seasons, the territories of rival individuals, to adjust hunting strategies based on the specific behavior of specific prey animals encountered before, to assess situations, a potential prey encounter, a confrontation with a rival, and make decisions based on something more than simple instinct. It would have meant social intelligence, the ability to recognize individual members of one's own species, to assess the status and strength of rivals, to engage in the extended behavioral interactions that seem implied by evidence for social behavior in T. Rex's relatives and possibly in T. Rex itself, and it would have meant, perhaps, something approaching emotional experience. Not human emotion, not the complex something approaching emotion, not the complex language-mediated emotional life of a human being, but the functional states that motivate behavior in cognitively complex animals. States that function like fear, like hunger, like curiosity, like the drive to defend territory or attract mates. These functional states are real in the biological sense. They influence behavior, regardless of whether we choose to use the word emotion to describe them. The T. Rex of the old model was a reflex machine. The T. Rex that the evidence increasingly suggests was something considerably more. One of the most fascinating and most underappreciated aspects of T. Rex's biology is what happened before it reached adulthood. T. Rex grew fast, extraordinarily fast, by the standards of large animals. The evidence comes from bone histology, the microscopic examination of bone tissue cross-sections, which reveals growth rings similar to the rings in a tree, laid down annually and recording the rate of bone deposition in each year of the animal's life. In T. Rex, specimens of different ages, these growth rings tell a story of explosive juvenile growth, followed by a plateau in adulthood. A young T. Rex grew at rates of roughly 2 kilograms per day during its fastest growth phase, an adolescent growth spurt that, over a period of perhaps 4 years, transformed an animal the size of a large dog into an animal larger than an elephant. This growth rate is comparable to the fastest growth rates seen in large modern birds and mammals, and far faster than anything seen in living reptiles. It is yet Another piece of evidence for endothermy. Only a warm-blooded animal with a high metabolic rate can sustain the energetic cost of growth at this speed, at birth or hatching. Since T. rex almost certainly hatched from eggs like all dinosaurs. A T. rex was approximately 40 to 60 centimeters long, a small, helpless, probably feather-covered creature that bore essentially no physical resemblance to the adult form. The enormous skull, the powerful hind limbs, the proportionally tiny arms. All of these adult features were absent or barely developed in the hatchling, which had a relatively large head in proportion to its body, large eyes, and the proportions of a very different animal. Over the first 10 years of life, a T. rex grew steadily, but not explosively, reaching perhaps a few hundred kilograms, roughly the size of a large lion. During these years, the young T. rex occupied a very different ecological niche from the adult. Its skull was narrower, its teeth were more blade-like and less robust, built for slicing rather than crushing, and its body was more lightly built and probably faster moving than the massive adult form. Young T. rexes were not small versions of adults. They were functionally different animals, hunting different prey, using different strategies, filling a different role in the ecosystem. This ecological transformation from a fast-moving, blade-toothed juvenile hunting, medium-sized prey to a massive, bone-crushing adult capable of tackling the largest herbivores is one of the most dramatic ontogenetic shifts known in any large predator. It means that a single T. rex, over the course of its lifetime, essentially changed its ecological role twice, once during the juvenile phase, once during the transition to full adult size and strength. Sometime around 10 years of age, the growth rate accelerated dramatically. This is the adolescent growth spurt, the phase of explosive development that added 2 kilograms or more per day to the animal's body mass for several years. By around 15 to 20 years of age, a T. rex had reached something close to its full adult size. The growth rings in the bone then begin to space more closely together, indicating slowing growth, and eventually, the bones show the polish and density of an adult animal no longer growing rapidly. The maximum lifespan of T. rex is estimated from the growth ring data in the oldest specimens at around 28 to 30 years. This is not a long life by the standards of large mammals. A human being of equivalent body mass might live 3 times as long, but it is consistent with the life histories of large birds and is appropriate for an animal with T. rex's metabolic rate and ecological circumstances. Of those 30 possible years, only the last 10 or so were spent as a fully grown apex predator. The majority of a T. rex's life was spent in smaller, more vulnerable, ecologically different body forms, a fact that has profound implications for understanding how T. rex experienced the world and how it fit into the ecosystem. The teeth of Tyrannosaurus rex are among the most studied biological structures in the entire fossil record, and with good reason. They are the primary direct interface between the animal and its prey, and they encode in their morphology and their wear patterns and their chemistry an enormous amount of information about how T. rex fed. An adult T. rex had between 50 and 60 teeth arranged in the upper and lower jaws in a D-shaped arcade. The teeth were not all the same. The front teeth, the incisors, were D-shaped in cross-section and were probably used for gripping. The side teeth were more blade-like and serrated adapted for cutting. But unlike the teeth of many carnivorous animals, T. rex's teeth were not particularly blade-like overall. They were thick, robust, banana-shaped in cross-section rather than blade-shaped. Built not primarily for slicing, but for penetrating bone. This is the key fact about T. rex dentition. Its teeth were designed to crush and penetrate bone, not simply to cut through soft tissue. The bite force of T. rex, estimated from the geometry of its jaw muscles and the strength of its skull bones, was approximately 35,000 to 60,000 newtons, the highest of any land animal that has ever lived, including the largest crocodilians. This is not a bite force adapted for cutting through meat, which requires relatively modest force if the teeth are sharp enough. This is a bite force adapted for destroying bone, and the fossil record confirms that T. rex used this capability routinely. Bones of T. rex's prey animals, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, have been found with distinctive puncture marks and bite traces that match T. rex tooth dimensions precisely. These marks show that T. rex bit deeply into the bones of its prey, often crushing them entirely. Tooth marks penetrate the shafts of large limb bones. Fragments of bone show the spiral fractures characteristic of having been broken by direct application of force rather than by decay or geological pressure. Most remarkably, analysis of coprolites, fossilized feces attributed to T. rex, has found abundant bone fragments, indicating that T. rex did not simply bite bones but consume them. It ate the bone. This has a clear nutritional logic. Bone is rich in fats, in the form of marrow and in minerals. An animal that could crush and consume bones was accessing a food resource that most carnivores, lacking the necessary bite force and tooth strength, had to leave behind. Rex was extracting the maximum possible nutrition from every carcass it processed, including the parts that no other predator could reach. This bone-crushing specialization also has implications for T. rex's role in its ecosystem. A predator that destroys and consumes the bones of its prey leaves far less behind for scavengers. The skeleton that remains after a T. rex has fed is more thoroughly processed than the remains left by any other large predator known. T. rex was, in a sense, an ecosystem service, a biological processor that converted the skeletons of large herbivores into energy and nutrients, reducing what would otherwise remain as long-enduring obstacles to decomposition and nutrient cycling. The teeth of T. rex were also replaced continuously throughout the animal's life. Like all non-avian dinosaurs, T. rex was polyphyodont, producing replacement teeth in a continuous cycle. A tooth that was lost in a violent encounter with prey was replaced by a new tooth growing up from below within a matter of months. This meant that the fearsome dentition of T. rex was never permanently compromised by individual tooth loss. The arsenal was always being restocked. What all of this tells us, assembled together, is that the feeding apparatus of T. rex was one of the most specialized, most powerful, most comprehensively adapted predatory systems in the history of terrestrial life. Not a generalist predator making do with an imperfect toolkit. A precisely engineered feeding machine, calibrated by tens of millions of years of evolution for the specific task of killing and consuming the largest herbivores of the late Cretaceous. The question of whether T. rex was primarily a hunter or primarily a scavenger is one of the longest-running debates in vertebrate paleontology, and it is worth addressing directly, both because it tells us a great deal about T. rex's actual ecology, and because the history of the debate itself is a fascinating window into how science works. The scavenger hypothesis was most prominently championed by paleontologist Jack Horner, one of the most influential dinosaur scientists of the late 20th century and the man who served as the scientific advisor for the Jurassic Park films. Horner argued that T-Rex's small arms, relatively slow locomotion, and exceptional olfactory capability were all more consistent with a scavenging lifestyle than with active predation. In his view, T-Rex was the Cretaceous equivalent of a vulture, enormous, powerfully built, but fundamentally an opportunist that located and consumed the dead rather than the living. The debate generated significant scientific attention and, if nothing else, forced the field to examine its assumptions about T-Rex's ecology more rigorously than it had before. The problem is that the evidence for the scavenger hypothesis, examined carefully, is weak. The theoretical argument rests on an assumption that the late Cretaceous ecosystem produced enough carcasses to sustain a population of large obligate scavengers, an assumption that population modeling has shown to be questionable. Large obligate scavengers are extremely rare in modern ecosystems, and where they exist, they are able to locate carcasses precisely because they cover enormous areas efficiently, using flight, in the case of vultures, or a combination of high mobility and exceptional senses in the case of hyenas. T-Rex, with its limited speed and its weight concentrated in a large, slow-moving body, was not well positioned to cover the large territories that obligate scavenging would have required. More directly, the fossil evidence tells us clearly that T-Rex attacked living animals. Bones of Edmontosaurus have been found with healed bite marks, injuries that the animal survived, recovering from wounds that only a living T-Rex could have inflicted. A tail vertebra of an Edmontosaurus specimen found in South Dakota bears the unmistakable marks of a T-Rex bite, with bone regrown around the injury, proof positive that the hadrosaur was alive after the attack and lived long enough for substantial healing to occur. You cannot bite a dead animal and then have the dead animal heal. The scientific consensus today is clear. T-Rex was primarily an active predator that also scavenged opportunistically when carcasses were available. This is, in fact, the lifestyle of virtually all large living predators: lions, tigers, wolves, none of which are either purely hunters or purely scavengers, but which take prey when they can and consume carrion when the opportunity presents itself. T-Rex was a hunter. The evidence is not seriously in dispute. A hunt begins not with movement, but with stillness. The late Cretaceous dawn breaks slowly over the floodplains of Laramidia, the light arriving first as a pale softening of the horizon before spreading gradually across the canopy of the riverside forests and the flat, sediment-rich lowlands beyond. The air is warm and humid. The smell of the river is everywhere. Water and mud and the rich organic scent of decaying plant matter at the river's margins. Birds that are not quite birds call from the trees above. Insects move in clouds over the water. And at the edge of the forest, almost entirely still, a Tyrannosaurus rex is watching. It has been there for some time. Its enormous body is partially concealed by the vegetation at the forest margin, not hidden. Exactly, since nothing the size of a school bus can truly hide in a forest, but positioned to minimize the visual cues its presence generates. No movement, minimal silhouette against the brightening sky behind it, the camouflage of motionlessness. Ahead, in the open floodplain, a herd of Edmontosaurus moves. There are perhaps 40 animals, females and juveniles mostly, with a few large males moving at the periphery. They are feeding, their broad, flat bills cropping the low-growing vegetation at the floodplain's edge, moving slowly across the landscape with the methodical thoroughness of large herbivores maximizing their daily caloric intake. They are not silent. The sound of 40 large animals moving through vegetation, vocalizing softly to maintain contact within the herd, is considerable, but they are not alarmed. Nothing has alarmed them yet. T-Rex watches. What is it assessing? Based on everything we know about the predatory behavior of large carnivores, from lions and tigers and wolves to the predatory birds that are T-Rex's closest living relatives, it is assessing vulnerability. Which animal in the herd is moving with less coordination than the others? Which one is slower to respond to the movements of its neighbors? Which individual is positioned, by chance or by its own behavioral choices, slightly farther from the center of the herd, and therefore slightly more isolated from the protective effect of group membership? The predator's eye, whether it belongs to a lion or a wolf or a T-Rex, is trained by natural selection to detect the signal of weakness in a crowd of prey. Not because the predator reasons through this process consciously, but because the individuals that were best at detecting the signal left more offspring than those that were worse at it. And over enough generations, the ability to read vulnerability in prey behavior became a fundamental feature of the predator's sensory and neural apparatus. T-Rex watches. Time passes. The herd moves. And then something changes. One of the Edmontosaurus near the herd's edge stumbles slightly on uneven ground and does not immediately recover its stride. The hesitation lasts perhaps 2 seconds. For most observers, it would be invisible. The T-Rex begins to move. How T-Rex actually approached prey is something we can reconstruct only partially from direct evidence, but the biomechanics of its locomotion and the behavior of its prey offer important constraints. The initial approach was almost certainly careful and slow, not the explosive sprint of cinema, but a measured advance designed to close distance without triggering the flight response of the prey until the predator was close enough for the final rush to succeed. This strategy is used by virtually every large predator that hunts prey capable of outrunning it. Patience during the approach, explosive acceleration at close range. At some point in the approach, triggered by the prey's response, by the distance closing to a threshold, by some assessment the predator made that the moment was right, the careful advance became something faster. What this faster movement looked like is a question that biomechanics has spent considerable effort trying to answer. The models suggest a brisk, powerful stride, not a running gait in the strict sense, since the bone stress analysis indicates that true running was probably not possible or safe, but something faster than a walk, a fast walk, sustained by the enormous hind limb muscles and the efficient gait mechanics we have discussed, covering ground at 20 kilometers per hour or somewhat more. Sustained over the relatively short distance needed to close on prey that was not expecting the attack, this speed would have been sufficient. The killing bite of T-Rex was almost certainly delivered to the prey's body, not the neck bite of a lion or a tiger, not the throat grasp of a wolf, but a direct penetrating bite to a large body region, the skull of T-Rex was not built for the sustained throttling hold of a constricting predator. It was built for delivering a devastating bone-crushing bite and then withdrawing, allowing the damage to do its work, following the prey if necessary, and striking again. This kill strategy, sometimes called the puncture-pull technique, based on analysis of feeding traces on fossil bones, involved biting deeply into the prey animal, often into major muscle groups or the pelvic region, with the full force of those enormous jaws, and then pulling the head back to tear free a large chunk of flesh and bone. The prey animal, even if it was the size of a Triceratops, receiving this treatment could not long survive. The blood loss, the tissue destruction, the shock, the combination was fatal. For prey the size of an adult Edmontosaurus or Triceratops, the attack may not have been a single engagement, a T. Rex confronting a large, healthy adult hadrosaur or ceratopsian was not necessarily guaranteed a swift kill. The prey animal would have fled if possible, and fled vigorously. Edmontosaurus was not built for high speed, but it could cover ground at a decent pace over short distances, and a herd would have produced significant chaos and distraction. Triceratops bore 3 horns capable of seriously injuring a predator and a frill that, while primarily a display structure, also partially protected the neck. The wound record in T-Rex bones confirms that hunting was not without risk. Multiple T-Rex specimens show healed injuries, broken ribs, damage to the facial bones, injuries to the vertebrae that are consistent with having been inflicted by prey animals fighting back. T-Rex was not invulnerable, it was powerful, but the animals it hunted were large, and large animals, when cornered or wounded and fighting for their lives, are dangerous. The willingness to accept risk in pursuit of prey and the resilience to survive and recover from the injuries that resulted was as much a part of T-Rex's predatory toolkit as its speed or its bite force. A predator that avoided all risk would starve. One that accepted calculated risk, recovered from injury, and learned from experience, as the healed wound record suggests T-Rex regularly did, could sustain itself across the decades of an adult life. Of all the questions that the new science of T-Rex has raised, perhaps the most transformative concerns its social life. For most of the history of T-Rex science, the animal was implicitly assumed to be solitary. This was never really an argument so much as an assumption, a default position inherited from the popular image of the animal as a lone predator, and perhaps also from the tendency to model dinosaur behavior on the behavior of living reptiles, most of which are indeed solitary. Large crocodilians gather around food sources, but they do not maintain social relationships. Large monitor lizards are typically solitary. The assumption that T-Rex behaved similarly was not scientifically argued. It was simply taken for granted. The evidence that has accumulated over the past 2 decades suggests this assumption may have been wrong. The first piece of evidence is trackway data. In several locations in the American West, fossil trackways have been found that show multiple large theropod individuals, animals of different sizes, consistent with adults and subadults of the same species, moving in the same direction at the same time. The trackways are parallel, not convergent or divergent, suggesting coordinated movement rather than sequential visits to the same location. Multiple individuals moving together. This is not proof of social behavior in T-Rex specifically, but it is consistent with it and inconsistent with strict solitary habits. The second piece of evidence is from multiple individual fossil sites. In a few locations, the remains of multiple T-Rex individuals have been found in close association, more individuals than would be expected by chance accumulation. The Rainbows and Unicorns Quarry in Montana, excavated in the 2010s, contained the partial remains of at least 3 T-Rex individuals found together. This site was studied extensively and the evidence carefully examined for alternative explanations. A river trap that had accumulated remains from different times and places for instance, rather than a genuine association of living animals. The conclusion of the research team was that the most parsimonious explanation was that these individuals were, at the time of their deaths, in the same location, together. A third line of evidence comes from comparisons with living archosaurs. The closest living relatives of T-Rex are birds, and birds, particularly the large ground-dwelling birds, whose ecology is in some ways most comparable to T-Rex, include many species that are not solitary. Cassowaries are largely solitary, but gather at resource patches. Emus are partially migratory and form loose groups. Many raptors form mated pairs with significant behavioral coordination. The assumption that a large, cognitively sophisticated archosaur, like T-Rex, was inevitably solitary, sits uncomfortably with the range of social behaviors seen across its living relatives. None of this constitutes proof of T-Rex sociality in any strong sense. The trackway evidence and the multi-individual fossil sites are suggestive but not conclusive. The comparison with living archosaurs provides a plausibility argument rather than a direct demonstration. What the evidence collectively suggests is that the assumption of strict solitude in T-Rex is not justified, that the animal may have had a more complex social life than the old model out, involving at minimum some degree of tolerance for conspecifics and possibly extending to more elaborate social interactions. If T-Rex was social, even occasionally, even in limited ways, the implications for its behavior and its cognitive demands are significant. Social animals need to recognize individual conspecifics. They need to assess the status and intentions of others. They need to communicate. They need to coordinate. All of these demands place pressure on the neural systems that support complex behavior, and all of them are consistent with the cognitive complexity that the brain evidence suggests, perhaps the most emotionally resonant aspect of T-Rex's biology, and the one that has changed most dramatically in recent scientific understanding, concerns how it cared for its young. The image of T-Rex as a parent, tending eggs, guarding nest sites, possibly feeding juveniles, would have seemed implausible to most paleontologists of 30 years ago. The reptilian model implied negligible parental care. Eggs deposited and abandoned. Hatchlings entirely self-sufficient. From birth, no lasting social bond between parent and offspring. The evidence now points in a different direction. Among the closest relatives of T-Rex, the Tyrannosaurids as a group, but more broadly the Coelurosaurian theropods, there is growing evidence for parental behavior comparable to that of modern birds. Nesting sites attributed to various theropod dinosaurs show evidence of incubation postures, adults positioned on or beside nests in ways consistent with brooding. Fossil sites have produced juvenile individuals in association with adult bones in circumstances suggesting family groups rather than random accumulation. The evolutionary logic also points towards significant parental investment. T-Rex's offspring were small and helpless at hatching. The rapid growth rate that characterizes the first years of life required substantial caloric input. Rex, weighing a few kilograms, could not yet access the same prey as an adult. Its skull proportions, its bite force, its body size were all wrong for hunting the large herbivores that sustained adults. It needed food and it needed protection for an extended period after hatching. Who provided this? The most parsimonious answer, the answer consistent with both the evolutionary position of T-Rex and the ecological logic of the situation, is the parents, an adult T-Rex. Rex, with its powerful hunting ability and its capacity to process large prey carcasses completely, could easily have provisioned young that were not yet capable of hunting effectively on their own. Carrying food to a nest site or allowing juveniles to feed from a kill made by the adult required nothing of T. Rex that it was not already doing for itself. The picture that emerges, tentative, provisional, subject to revision as more evidence accumulates, is of a T. Rex that maintained a nest site, that incubated eggs, or at least guarded them, and that provisioned its young through at least the early stages of their development. A T. Rex that was not merely a predator, but a parent, that experienced, in some functional sense, the poles of attachment and the drives of protection that we associate with parental behavior across the animal kingdom. This is speculation built on reasonable inference, but it is not idle speculation. It follows from the evolutionary position of the animal, from the ecology of its offspring, and from the growing fossil evidence for parental care in T. rex's relatives. The old image of T. rex as a solitary asocial killer that laid eggs and walked away is almost certainly wrong. T. rex, the evidence suggests, stayed the daily life of Tyrannosaurus rex. What it actually did on an ordinary day, the rhythms of its existence, is something we can reconstruct only in the broadest outline. Behavior leaves traces in the fossil record only when it is extreme or unusual enough to create durable physical evidence. The quiet hours of a predator's day, the resting, the waiting, the slow movement through familiar territory, leave almost nothing. But from the physiology, from the ecology, from the comparison with living animals of similar body size and metabolic strategy, we can sketch the broad shape of a T. rex's day. T. rex was almost certainly active during both day and night, at least to some degree. The evidence from its sensory systems suggests an animal capable of operating in low light conditions. Its large eyes were built for gathering light, and the brain's investment in visual processing suggests that vision was not limited to bright daylight. Large, warm-blooded apex predators in modern ecosystems are typically active across a wide range of light conditions, hunting when opportunities arise rather than being restricted to specific activity windows. The metabolic demands of a T. rex maintaining a large, warm body, fueling locomotion, supporting the growth and repair of tissues, required substantial food intake. Estimates of the daily caloric requirement of an adult T. rex suggest a need for the equivalent of roughly 40 to 100 kilograms of meat per day, depending on the assumptions made about metabolic rate. This is a substantial requirement, and it means that feeding was a major occupation of T. rex's daily existence, not a brief event, but an extended process of hunting, killing, consuming, and digesting. A successful hunt against a large prey animal might provide enough food to sustain an adult T. rex for several days. In this case, the day following a large kill would have been characterized by prolonged feeding at the carcass, using those bone-crushing teeth to process every accessible part of the carcass, extracting marrow from crushed bones, consuming tissues that would become inaccessible as the carcass cooled and dried. This extended feeding bout would have been followed by a period of rest and digestion, a quiet day. Metabolically speaking, as the digestive system processed a massive caloric intake. On days without a fresh kill, T. rex would have been more active, patrolling its territory, investigating scent trails, monitoring the movements of prey herds. The combination of excellent olfaction and the efficient walking gait we have discussed what have made these territorial patrols metabolically manageable, covering large areas without expending excessive energy, gathering information about the location and composition of prey, herds, the presence of rival individuals, the general state of the ecosystem within its range. The territory of an adult T-Rex was large. Estimates based on the population density of the species and the food requirements of individuals suggest home ranges of hundreds of square kilometers for adults. This is consistent with the territories of large living predators in similar ecological roles. A male lion's territory in a productive savanna might cover 200 square kilometers. A large tiger in a productive forest environment might range over 100 to 200 square kilometers. T-Rex, hunting prey of greater average body mass but in a less densely productive environment than a modern savanna, likely patrolled a territory at the larger end of these comparisons. Within this territory, T-Rex would have known the landscape intimately. The river crossings, the meadows where prey herds grazed at predictable times, the forest margins where visibility was good, the boggy ground near the inland sea shore where large prey animals sometimes became mired. This knowledge was accumulated over years of experience, and it was a form of capital, cognitive capital, translated directly into hunting success and caloric intake. T-Rex knew its world, not in the way a human being knows a familiar landscape, not with language and maps and the explicit memory of named places, but in the way that any cognitively sophisticated animal knows the territory it has spent years moving through as a felt sense of where to go, when, and what to expect there. Encounters between adult T-Rex individuals were probably rare but significant events, moments when the solitude of the predator's territorial existence was interrupted by the presence of another animal of equal size, equal power, and potentially conflicting interests. The evidence for intraspecific competition in T-Rex. Competition between individuals of the same species comes from multiple sources. Bite marks on T-Rex, bones from other T-Rex individuals have been documented in multiple specimens. These marks appear on the skull, the facial bones, the limbs, the bite patterns of a T-Rex directed at another T-Rex. In some cases, the bite marks show signs of healing. The bone has begun to remodel around the wound, indicating that the bitten individual survived the encounter. In other cases, the marks are on bones that show no healing, suggesting that the injury either contributed to the animal's death or occurred after death. What do these bite marks tell us about T-Rex social interactions? At minimum, they tell us that adult T-Rex individuals sometimes came into direct physical contact with each other in contexts that involved biting, contexts that were at least sometimes combative. They do not tell us whether these encounters were territorial disputes, competition over food, or something else entirely. But the pattern, repeated, cross-specimen evidence of T-Rex biting T-Rex is consistent with a territorial species in which adults occasionally fought, as most territorial large predators do. The display structures of T-Rex, if it had them, would have been the first line of defense against the costs of direct combat. Large, dangerous animals that must sometimes compete with conspecifics benefit from having honest signals of size, strength, and fighting ability that allow rivals to assess each other without physical engagement. If one individual is clearly larger, healthier, and more formidable than another, a display that communicates this fact allows the smaller individual to withdraw without being injured and allows the larger individual to achieve its competitive goal without risking injury from a desperate adversary. What display structures T. rex may have had is almost entirely unknown. Soft tissue structures, crests, wattles, dewlaps, color patches rarely fossilize and leave almost no trace in the skeleton. Some T. rex specimens show texture patterns on the skull bones that have been interpreted as evidence of keratinous structures above the eyes or along the snout, perhaps small horns or crests, but the evidence is limited and contested. It is entirely possible that T. rex had elaborate soft tissue display structures of which we are completely unaware. The fossils we have are bones, and bones are only part of an animal. The rest, the skin, the colors, the sounds, the behaviors that evolved primarily in soft tissue, is for the most part gone. What remains is the skeleton, and the skeleton of T. rex is extraordinary. It is extraordinary, not as a museum piece or a cultural icon, but as a biological record, a record of how an animal lived, how it grew, how it was injured and recovered, what it ate, and how it ate it, how fast it moved, and in what direction, how old it was when it died, and what the long decades of its life had done to its body. The bones of T. rex are a biography, and the biography, read carefully, is not the story of a monster. It is the story of an animal, one of the most remarkable animals that has ever lived, shaped by 70 million years of evolution into a form precisely calibrated for the world it inhabited, living and hunting and growing and aging and perhaps caring for its young in the forests and floodplains of late Cretaceous North America. An animal that was real, that breathed, that had experiences, functional states that drove its behavior, perceptions of the world around it shaped by senses we have only recently begun to understand, a cognitive life richer than the old models allowed, an animal that was alive in a world very different from ours a very long time ago, and then it was gone. T. rex did not appear fully formed in the late Cretaceous. It was the product of a long evolutionary lineage, a dynasty of tyrannosauroid theropods that began small and obscure in the Middle Jurassic, roughly 160 million years ago, and grew over the course of nearly 100 million years into the most formidable terrestrial predator of its era. Understanding this lineage is essential for understanding T. rex, because many of the features that define the animal, its large size, its specialized skull, its reduced forelimbs, its ecological dominance, were not innovations that appeared suddenly and fully formed. They were the cumulative product of evolutionary changes accumulated across millions of years and dozens of species, each one building incrementally on what came before. The earliest tyrannosauroids were small animals. Guanlong Wukai, discovered in China and dating to approximately 160 million years ago, was roughly 3 meters long, no larger than a large dog, and anatomically very different from T. rex in most respects. It had long arms. It had a prominent crest on its skull that probably functioned as a display structure. Its teeth were blade-like and built for cutting, not the banana-shaped bone crushers of T. rex. It was, by all appearances, a medium-sized predator occupying a niche that would today be filled by an animal like a leopard, opportunistic, agile, capable of tackling prey, smaller than itself, and occasionally challenging for larger prey. But in the proportions of its hind limbs, in certain features of its skull architecture, in the details of its foot anatomy, Guanlong carried the blueprint, that would 100 million years later produce Tyrannosaurus rex. The lineage was already there in embryonic form in this crested 3-meter predator moving through the Jurassic forests of China. Over the following tens of millions of years, the Tyrannosauroid lineage diversified. Different species evolved in different parts of the world: Asia, Europe, North America, adapting to different environments and ecological conditions. Some remained small, others grew larger. The skull architecture that characterizes the family: deep, robust, with the kinetics that would eventually support the enormous bite forces of the late Cretaceous giants, developed gradually through this period of diversification. In the mid-Cretaceous, perhaps 90 to 100 million years ago, the lineage that would produce T. rex was established in Western North America. Animals like Dryptosaurus and later Teratones and Bistahevosaurs show successive stages in the development of the Tyrannosaurid body plan, growing larger, the skull becoming deeper and more robust, the forelimbs proportionally shorter, the hind limbs more powerful. Each step in this transformation was a response to the ecological pressures of the Laramidian ecosystem, which in the mid to late Cretaceous was progressively losing the large Allosaurid and Carcharodontosaurid predators that had dominated earlier periods, leaving ecological space for new apex predators to evolve into. The Tyrannosaurids filled that space. In a process that paleontologists call ecological replacement, the Tyrannosaurid lineage grew to fill the large predator niche that the declining Allosaurids vacated, and in filling it, they were released from the selective pressures that had kept them smaller when larger competitors occupied the niche above them. They grew and grew and grew. T. rex itself appears in the fossil record approximately 68 million years ago, already nearly the form we know from the museums. The evolutionary changes that produced it from its immediate ancestors were relatively modest, refinements to an already impressive predatory design rather than revolutionary innovations. By the time T. rex walked the floodplains of the Hell Creek Formation, the long evolutionary experiment that had begun with Guanlong in the Jurassic had produced something that was, in its ecological niche, essentially perfected. It would last for approximately 2 million years. Then it would be gone. T. rex's closest relatives within the Tyrannosaurid family include animals that help illuminate which features of T. rex's biology were general to the family and which were unique to the species. Tarbosaurus bataar, from the Nemegt Formation of Mongolia, is among the closest relatives of T. rex, so close that some researchers have argued it should be classified as a second species of Tyrannosaurus rather than a separate genus. Tarbosaurus was approximately the same size as T. rex, with the same general body plan, the same reduced forelimbs, the same deep skull. But there were differences. Tarbosaurus's skull was somewhat narrower, its forelimbs even more reduced relative to T. rex's, and its binocular field of vision less developed. These differences probably reflect the somewhat different ecological conditions of the Asian ecosystem it inhabited, a world with different prey species and different competitive pressures. Zhucheng tyrannus from China, known from fragmentary skull material, was probably comparable in size to T. rex and represents the apex of Asian Tyrannosaurid evolution. Lithron X argestes from Utah, dating to about 80 million years ago, shows that the deep-skulled, wide-headed body plan characteristic of T. rex and its closest relatives evolved early in the lineage. The wide head and binocular vision that give T. rex its distinctive profile were not late innovations, but established features of the lineage for millions of years before the species itself appeared. Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus, from Alberta and Montana respectively, are earlier and more lightly built tyrannosaurids, around 8 million years older than T. rex and roughly half its size. These animals were faster and more gracile than T. rex, their hind limbs proportionally longer and their skulls less massively built. They appear to have hunted in a somewhat different style from T. rex, more pursuit-oriented, less reliant on the bone-crushing bite force that defines the later giants. Most fascinatingly, sites in Alberta have produced evidence that Albertosaurus may have been a pack hunter. The Dry Island Buffalo Jump site, excavated by Barnum Brown in the early 20th century and re-examined more recently, contains the remains of more than 20 individual Albertosaurus specimens of different ages, juveniles, subadults, and adults, accumulated in the same deposit. The most thorough analysis of this site has concluded that the most likely explanation for this accumulation is a social group, animals that traveled and possibly hunted together, that died simultaneously, perhaps in a flood or some other catastrophic event. If Albertosaurus was a pack hunter, was T. rex? The question is unanswerable with current evidence. T. rex does not have an equivalent mass accumulation site, but the social behavior of the closely related Albertosaurus is one more data point suggesting that the strict solitude assumed for tyrannosaurids as a group was not, perhaps, the norm. The ecosystem that T. rex inhabited was not static. Over the roughly 2 million years that T. rex existed as a species, the environment of late Cretaceous North America changed, climate fluctuating, sea levels rising and falling, the composition of the plant and animal communities shifting in response to these changes. The Hell Creek Formation, the geological unit that preserves the richest record of T. rex and its contemporaries, represents the last roughly 1.5 million years of the Cretaceous period, the very end of the Mesozoic era. The animals and plants preserved in Hell Creek are a snapshot of an ecosystem in what appears, in retrospect, to have been its final chapter. The Hell Creek ecosystem was productive and diverse. T. rex shared its world with the ceratopsians, horned dinosaurs, including not just Triceratops, but also the rarer Torosaurus, animals whose skulls were among the largest of any land animal that has ever lived. The hadrosaurs were abundant, Edmontosaurus particularly common, potentially present in large migratory herds that moved through the lowland forests in seasonal patterns. Smaller dinosaurs filled the ecological roles that smaller mammals fill in today's ecosystems. Ornithopods cropping vegetation at lower levels, small theropods hunting insects, and small vertebrates, the first true placentals, scurrying through the undergrowth. Above all of this, the plants were changing. The flowering plants, the angiosperms, had continued their Cretaceous radiation and now dominated the understory and many of the river margin habitats of the lowlands. The forests were not the conifer-dominated landscapes of earlier Mesozoic periods, but increasingly diverse communities of broad-leaved flowering trees and shrubs. Landscapes that in some respects would have looked more recognizable to modern eyes than the forests of the Jurassic. The climate of the late Cretaceous Hell Creek environment fluctuated considerably on scales of tens of thousands of years, driven by astronomical cycles and by the ongoing geological changes associated with the formation of the Rocky Mountains. There were warm periods and cooler periods. There were wet seasons and dry seasons. There was, almost certainly, seasonal variation, in the availability of prey. Periods when the hadrosaur herds were present and prey was abundant, and periods when the herds had moved on and T. Rex hunted sparser, less mobile prey. T. Rex dealt with this variability the way all large, long-lived predators deal with it, through behavioral flexibility, through memory, through the accumulated ecological knowledge that allowed it to find prey when prey was not abundant and to exploit abundance when it occurred. The pathology record of T. rex, the diseases and injuries recorded in its bones, provides a window into the physical reality of its life that no other evidence can offer. We have already mentioned Sue's gout and trichomoniasis-like jaw infection, but the pathology record across multiple T. rex specimens tells a broader story. Stress fractures are common in T. rex specimens, fine cracks in bones caused not by single traumatic events, but by the cumulative damage of repetitive loading over time. In a bipedal animal of 9 tons, every walking stride places enormous repetitive stress on the leg bones, and the evidence of stress fractures in T. rex specimens is consistent with an animal that was chronically active, walking long distances regularly throughout its adult life. Healed rib fractures appear in multiple specimens. Ribs are vulnerable to injury during prey encounters. A large prey animal kicking or thrashing can deliver a blow sufficient to fracture ribs, even in an animal as large as T. rex. The healing of these fractures, the bone callus that forms around a healed fracture site, tells us that the injuries were survived, that T. rex continued to hunt and live with the pain and mechanical compromise of a healing rib. There is no option for an apex predator to take a medical leave of absence. Infections of bone, osteomyelitis, have been documented in several T. rex specimens. These infections, caused by bacteria entering the bone through injuries or through the bloodstream, produced characteristic patterns of bone destruction and reactive new bone growth that are recognizable in fossils. The infections represent a form of suffering, chronic, debilitating, potentially fatal over the long term. That is easy to overlook when contemplating the power and physical dominance of the animal. T. rex was not invulnerable. It was in pain. Sometimes it was sick. Sometimes it carried in its bones the record of a life that was physically demanding in ways that modern predators, with their relatively modest prey and their relatively modest prey and their relative agility, rarely experience. The sheer scale of everything T. rex did, every step, every strike, every feeding bout, was conducted at a bodily cost commensurate with its size. The most poignant pathologies, perhaps, are the ones that tell us about the end. Sue's jaw infection, the trichomoniasis-like condition that eroded holes in several of her jawbones, would have interfered with feeding. As the infection progressed, swallowing would have become increasingly difficult. An apex predator that cannot feed effectively is an apex predator on a slow trajectory toward starvation. The cause of Sue's eventual death is not known. We do not have a death scene, only a skeleton. But the jaw infection was real, and it was serious. And it speaks to the fact that even the most formidable predator in its world was not exempt from the biological vulnerability that is the condition of every living thing. T. rex did not go extinct because it failed. It did not go extinct because a better predator replaced it, or because its prey disappeared, or because it could not adapt to changing climate. It went extinct because of a catastrophic event so sudden and so total in its effects that no large land animal anywhere on Earth survived it. At approximately 66 million years ago, a belied An asteroid or comet approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, hitting at an angle of roughly 45 to 60 degrees and at a velocity of approximately 20 kilometers per second. The energy released by this impact was approximately 1 billion times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The immediate effects, the fireball, the tsunami, the earthquakes, were catastrophic over a regional scale, but the global effects were what ended the Mesozoic. The impact vaporized enormous quantities of rock, ejecting material into the stratosphere that spread around the planet within days. This dejecta layer blocked sunlight on a global scale, triggering a period of darkness and cold, an impact winter that persisted for months to perhaps years. Without sunlight, photosynthesis failed. Plants died. The food chains built on plant production collapsed from the bottom up in the long months of darkness and cold that followed the large body size that had been T. Rex's greatest asset became its greatest liability, a large warm-blooded predator. Maintaining a high body temperature requires enormous amounts of food that was no longer available. The prey animals that T-Rex depended on were dying because the plants they ate were dying. The ecosystem that had sustained the entire community of large Cretaceous animals was unraveling at every level simultaneously. T-Rex could not adapt to this. No large land animal could. The speed of the collapse, measured in months and years, rather than the thousands and millions of years over which evolutionary adaptation operates, meant that behavioral or physiological adjustments were simply not possible. The animals that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were, almost without exception, small enough to survive on the reduced food resources available in the years following the impact, small enough to go dormant if necessary, small enough to exploit the scattered refugia where some primary productivity persisted. The last T-Rex that ever lived died in a world that was already a shadow of the world it had been born into. The forests were dying, the prey herds were scattered and diminished. The skies were dark in the middle of the day. The temperatures, which had been declining for months, were still falling. We do not know and cannot know whether T-Rex experienced anything like an awareness of what was happening. But the animal was real. It was alive, breathing, perceiving the world through its extraordinary senses. And then it was not. The last T-Rex died, and with it, the most formidable apex predator that terrestrial evolution had ever produced in the rock. But T-Rex is not entirely gone. This is one of the most remarkable facts in all of paleontology. One that has moved from heretical speculation to established scientific consensus within the span of a single human generation. The evolutionary lineage of T-Rex did not end 66 million years ago. It survived. Diminished, radically transformed, freed by the extinction of the large, non-avian dinosaurs to diversify into the ecological niche that opened in the survivor's wake, but present, continuous, unbroken. The birds are dinosaurs, not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, a lineage of theropod dinosaurs that had been present since the Jurassic, that survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction because of their small body size and their dietary flexibility, and that subsequently diversified into one of the most species-rich groups of vertebrates on Earth. T. Rex is not directly ancestral to any living bird, The lineage that produced modern birds diverged from the Tyrannosaur lineage hundreds of millions of years before T. rex existed. But T. rex and the living birds are cousins, members of the same great clade of theropod dinosaurs. The feathers on a chicken are the evolutionary descendants of the feathers that covered the ancestors of the feathers that covered the ancestors. Rex, the wishbone in a Thanksgiving turkey, is the same bone, the furcula, that was present in T. Rex's skeleton, the three-toed foot of a crow, its scales, its mode of reproduction, its warm-bloodedness, all of these are archosaur features shared with T. rex, modified and refined over 66 million years of evolution, but recognizably connected. When you watch a bird, any bird, you are watching a living dinosaur, not a metaphor, not a romantic projection. A literal, biological, taxonomically valid dinosaur, carrying in its body the evolutionary heritage of the most successful group of large land animals in the history of the planet. T. rex looked at the world through forward-facing eyes. So does a hawk. T. rex communicated through low-frequency sound. So does an emu. T. rex hatched from eggs and, probably, cared for its young. So does every living bird. T. rex had feathers. So does every living bird. T. rex had a wishbone and hollow bones and a four-chambered heart and an air sac respiratory system and warm blood and a fast metabolism and the capacity for complex behavior. So does every living bird. The connection is real. The lineage is unbroken. T. rex is not extinct in the way that the trilobites are extinct, or the ammonites, or the plesiosaurs. Its biological legacy is alive in 10,000 species of birds distributed across every continent and every ecosystem on Earth. This does not diminish the loss of T. rex itself, the specific, irreplaceable, magnificent animal that walked the late Cretaceous floodplains and is now known only from its bones. That animal is gone, and its goneness is a real absence. But the lineage, the evolutionary thread that connects the first small feathered theropods of the Triassic to T. rex in the Cretaceous to the crow on your windowsill, is not broken. Life does not give up. It diminishes and recovers. It is catastrophically disrupted and finds new forms. It loses its largest expressions and rebuilds from the smallest survivors. The story of life on Earth is the story of this resilience, not the steady march of progress, not the inevitable triumph of the most powerful, but the endless, patient, innovative persistence of the living against the indifferent enormity of geological time. T. rex was part of that story, a magnificent, brief, irreplaceable part. And the story continues. Science is not a fixed body of knowledge. It is a process, a continuous, self-correcting, argumentative, creative process of asking questions, gathering evidence, proposing explanations, and revising those explanations when new evidence demands it. Nowhere in all of paleontology is this process more visible, more active, or more consequential than in the study of T. rex. The T. rex that scientists are studying right now in laboratories equipped with instruments that did not exist 20 years ago, using techniques borrowed from chemistry and genetics and physics and computational biology, is not the T. rex of the textbooks of the 1980s. It is a richer, stranger, more biologically complex animal, and the research is not finished. New questions are being asked, new evidence is being collected, the picture is still changing. Consider what has happened in just the last decade. In 2013, a team of paleontologists announced the discovery of Tyrannosaurus rex specimens in a new site in Montana. Specimens that, when examined in detail, suggested the presence of not just one or two individuals, but a group of 3 or more, found together in circumstances consistent with simultaneous death. The implication that T-Rex might have been traveling together when they died reopened the question of Tyrannosaur sociality with new force, with scientists examining every alternative explanation for the multi-individual accumulation and working to distinguish a genuine social grouping from the mere coincidental accumulation of remains. In 2016, researchers examining the facial bones of T-Rex specimens in unprecedented detail reported evidence of flat scale-covered facial skin with a dense network of sensory structures, trigeminal nerve foramina comparable to what is seen in crocodilians, which use the skin of their face as a highly sensitive tactile organ. If T-Rex had a similarly sensitive face, the implications are intriguing. The enormous skull was not just a weapon platform, but a sensory instrument capable of detecting vibrations and perhaps even subtle temperature differences through direct facial contact. A T-Rex pressing its face against the ground to feel the vibrations of a distant herd. A T-Rex using facial contact in social or parental interactions. These are speculative extrapolations from the anatomical data, but they are extrapolations grounded in the evidence. In 2019, a study of T-Rex's lip anatomy, based on comparison with the jawbones of living animals and the distribution of nerve and blood vessel foramina in the teeth and jawbones of T-Rex specimens, concluded that T-Rex most likely had lips, not the thin, scale-covered lips of a lizard exactly, but soft tissue covering the teeth when the mouth was closed, similar to the condition seen in many living reptiles and very different from the perpetually exposed teeth of cinematic T-Rex. If T-Rex had lips, the teeth were covered and protected when not in use, kept moist and shielded from the drying effects of open-air exposure. The iconic image of T-Rex with its teeth perpetually on display. The exposed, glistening, ever-threatening dentition of 1,000 movie posters may be wrong. These are not trivial revisions. Each one of them changes something about how we visualize the animal, how we understand its behavior, how we interpret the evidence. And each one of them reflects the maturation of T-Rex science from a discipline based primarily on descriptive morphology describing what the bones look like, to one that draws on the full toolkit of modern biology to extract functional and behavioral information from the fossil record. The most ambitious ongoing research program in T-Rex science concerns something that would have seemed like science fiction to paleontologists of 30 years ago: the recovery of biological molecules from T-Rex fossils. In 2005, paleontologist Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University announced the discovery of what appeared to be soft tissue preserved inside the femur of a T-Rex specimen from Montana. The tissue, visible after the bone was demineralized in weak acid, included what appeared to be blood vessels, cells, and a flexible, transparent matrix. The announcement was met with significant skepticism because the conventional wisdom held that organic molecules could not survive for 66 million years. The biochemistry of degradation seemed to make it impossible. Subsequent research has confirmed the basic finding and extended it. Multiple T-Rex specimens, as well as specimens of other dinosaurs, have yielded what appear to be preserved organic molecules, fragments of proteins, possibly including collagen, the structural protein that makes up much of the matrix of bone. The preservation mechanism, exactly how these molecules have survived for tens of millions of years, is still being studied and debated. Some researchers have proposed that iron from the dinosaur's blood, acting as a natural fixative after death, may have cross-linked and stabilized the molecules against degradation. Others have proposed mineral substitution or other mechanisms. What is not in dispute is that the molecules are there and that they are biological in origin. The implications are profound. If proteins can be recovered from T-Rex fossils, then in principle, it becomes possible to compare T-Rex's proteins directly with those of living animals, to ask at the molecular level how closely related T-Rex is to different groups of living vertebrates, and perhaps even to infer aspects of its physiology that cannot be read from bone morphology alone. Early protein analyses comparing fragments of T-Rex collagen with the collagen sequences of living animals have produced results that are consistent with the evolutionary relationship between dinosaurs and birds, placing T-Rex's molecular signature closer to birds and crocodilians than to any other living group. This is not a surprise. It is exactly what the anatomical evidence would predict. But the fact that it can be confirmed at the molecular level from a 66-million-year-old fossil is a remarkable demonstration of what is becoming possible. The ultimate goal, recovering DNA from T-Rex, sequencing it, reading the genetic code of an extinct animal, remains, for now, beyond reach. DNA is far more fragile than proteins, and the conditions required for its preservation over 66 million years are almost certainly not achievable in any natural geological setting. The T-Rex of Jurassic Park, cloned from ancient DNA, will remain fiction, but the recovery of proteins is real, and the science built on it is advancing rapidly. The question of what T-Rex means to us, why it has captured the human imagination so completely and held it for so long, is not a scientific question, but it is a real one, and it deserves some attention. T-Rex was first described scientifically by Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History in 1905. The name he gave it, Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king, was a piece of naming bravado, a declaration about the animal's character and significance made before the evidence had fully accumulated to support it. Osborn was, as it turned out, not wrong. The name has proven appropriate. Within years of its first description, T-Rex was famous. It appeared in newspapers and magazines. It was depicted in illustrations, and in early film, it became, almost immediately, the representative dinosaur. The one that stood for all dinosaurs in the popular imagination, the one that defined what a dinosaur was in the minds of people who had never thought carefully about paleontology and would never need to. Why T-Rex? Why not Triceratops, which is by any measure equally impressive, and which some surveys have suggested is actually more recognized by young children? Why not Brachiosaurus, the long-necked giant that dwarfed T-Rex in absolute body mass? Why not Ankylosaurus, armored and imposing? Part of the answer is surely the combination of features that T-Rex presents: the enormous size, the dramatic bipedal posture, the disproportionate skull with its visible teeth, the famous small arms that create a silhouette unlike any other animal. It is a visually distinctive creature. Its profile, once seen, is not easily forgotten. But there is something deeper at work. T-Rex does something to the imagination that its equally impressive contemporaries do not. It activates something old, some response to the recognition of a predator larger than anything that should, by rights, exist. an animal that would, in any rational assessment, eat you without hesitation if you appeared before it. An animal that is simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, that generates in equal measure the impulse to look more closely and the impulse to run. This dual response, the attraction to the dangerous, the beautiful, the overwhelmingly powerful, is itself a biological feature of the human mind. It evolved because in the environments where human ancestors lived, the ability to be drawn to information about large predators while also being motivated to avoid them was adaptive. We are wired to find T. rex compelling. We cannot help it. But there is also something more specific at work in our relationship with T. rex, something that has intensified as the science has changed. The more we learn about what T. rex actually was, the warmer, more intelligent, more socially complex, more behaviorally rich animal that the evidence reveals, the more interesting it becomes. Not despite the scientific complexity, but because of it. The T. rex of the 1950s was a monster. You could admire it in a detached way, the way you admire a very large machine, or a natural force, or a weapon. But it did not invite the kind of engagement that a living animal invites, the kind that involves projecting experience into another body and asking what it was like to be there. The T. rex of the 2020s is something different. It is an animal, a warm-blooded, feather-bearing, parent, cognitively sophisticated, sensorially rich animal that experienced the world in some functional sense from the inside. That is not a machine or a force or a weapon. It is a mind and a body, a very large, very powerful, very different mind and body from our own, but one that has enough in common with the minds and bodies we know to make the question, what was it like? Feel answerable, not fully answerable. Never fully answerable. The interior of a T. rex's experience is separated from us by 66 million years and by a difference in nervous system organization so profound that any attempt to project human interiority onto it is likely to mislead more than it illuminates. But the question is no longer absurd. The evidence that the question is worth asking, that T. rex had enough cognitive complexity for the word experience to mean something has arrived. And with that evidence comes something unexpected, something that does not usually accompany the study of extinct organisms, something that might be called grief. Not grief for T. rex itself. Exactly. The animal lived a full and biologically successful existence. It was not robbed of anything by its extinction. It could not have known that its world was ending, had no concept of continuity across geological time, felt no loss in the ordinary sense. The grief, if that is the right word, is ours. It is the grief of knowing that something extraordinary existed, that it is gone, that we are separated from it by a distance, of time, of biology, of the irreversibility of extinction that cannot be crossed. We can study its bones. We can reconstruct its biology. We can produce images and models and films that approximate its appearance and movement. We can increasingly recover its molecules and read the biochemical language of its body, but we cannot hear it. We cannot watch it move through its actual world with its actual colors and sounds and behaviors in their full ecological context. We cannot know with any certainty what its experience was like. The things that would make it fully alive to us, the things that would make it not just a biological reconstruction, but a presence, are irretrievably gone. This is the condition of paleontology: to study animals that are beyond reach, to reconstruct, as faithfully as the evidence allows, beings that will never be known directly, to sit with the knowledge that the world has contained, at various points in its long history, living things of such diversity and such improbability that any honest accounting of life on Earth must include them even in their absence. T-Rex is the most famous of these absences, the one that most people know by name, that most children have encountered in museums or books or films, that has been woven most deeply into the fabric of human culture. It is the dinosaur, the representative of an entire era of Earth history that is so remote from our own time that it is, in practical terms, as alien as another planet. And yet we know it, not perfectly, not completely, not as we know a living animal we can observe in the field, but we know its bones and what they tell us. We know its growth patterns and its injuries and its diet and its evolutionary history. We know it was warm-blooded and fast-growing and probably feathered and probably a devoted parent and more intelligent than anyone imagined a generation ago. We know it had excellent vision and extraordinary smell and heard the world in low, resonant frequencies that traveled through the forests of the late Cretaceous like a language we will never learn. We know, in other words, that it was real, not a monster, not an icon, not a symbol or a metaphor. An animal, a specific, irreplaceable, magnificently adapted animal that lived and breathed and hunted and perhaps loved its young in the floodplains of North America 66 million years ago. The knowledge is imperfect. The loss is real. And the imperfect knowledge is enough, more than enough, to make T-Rex one of the most extraordinary things that this planet has ever produced. The bones are still out there in the badlands of Montana and South Dakota and Wyoming, waiting to be found. New specimens will be discovered. New techniques will extract new information from old specimens. The picture will continue to change and deepen and surprise. The science of T-Rex is not finished. It has barely started. Rest now. In the late Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, a forest is quiet in the hour before dawn. The air is warm and thick with the smell of the river nearby, of flowering plants, of earth and water, and the rich, organic complexity of an ancient, living world. The sky through the canopy above is beginning to lighten very faintly at the horizon. At the edge of the forest, something large is at rest. Its body is immense, the body of an adult, in the full power of its prime, 10 tons of muscle and bone shaped by evolution into the most formidable predator its world has ever seen. Its eyes are closed. Its chest rises and falls slowly, evenly, the breathing of deep rest, the breathing of an animal that has eaten well and has no immediate threat to attend to. It is warm to the touch. Its feathers, or scales, or some combination of both, in the pattern we have not yet fully worked out, lie smooth and close. Its tail is still. Its enormous skull, supported at rest by the position of the body, is quiet. It is sleeping. 66 million years separated from you. More time than the mind can honestly comprehend, and yet the sleep is recognizable. The stillness, the slow breath, the warmth of a body at rest, because it is life, and life, wherever it appears and in whatever form it takes, carries within it this recognizable pulse. Sleep now. The T-Rex is sleeping too, in the forest of the late Cretaceous, in the last chapter of its world. It will wake at dawn. It will hunt. It will live the day that it has. And across all that time, In all that darkness, something connects the pulse of its life to yours. The continuity of biology. The unbroken chain from the first life in the ancient ocean to the feathered theropods of the Jurassic to the forests of the Cretaceous to the world that emerged from the catastrophe, rebuilt indifferent, and carrying within it the survivors of everything that came before. You are part of that chain. So was T. Rex.